Thank you so much, Meta, and we've been talking for a little while about this opportunity, and I'm really delighted to be part of this terrific series. I commend you. I commend our guests today, the audience, for regularly participating and supporting this type of series, public discourse, public debate. Would that it were a little bit more aggressive, enthusiastic, in my view, is all for the good, and I will defend that position about Canada needing to be even more activist, passionate, aggressive about its public discourse, because at some point over the next 100 years, and I try to think, I'm a child of Soviet parents, they thought in 5-year plans. I try to think in 10 or 15 years, even 50 years down the road, life might become a little bit more difficult for us as a country strategically, and therefore the stakes will become much more grand, and the felt seriousness will have to be greater than it is today. But I'll get to that, and some of them will be provocations for your interest, but a lot of it will be analytical. So bear with me. I'm speaking to you at a moment where, although I'm often a public and scholarly critic of Canadian strategy, and I'll speak about strategy and all that entails in a second, although I'm quite a fierce and known to be quite a fierce critic and analyst in this respect, I come from a posture of pride today because we're at the apex of the Olympics. We're doing well, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms. So my shoulders are high today, and I'm a big Gretzky fan. Is anyone not a Gretzky fan here? As I said to my son the other day, I said, Noah, he's 7, he's our firstborn, our eldest of 3. I said, Noah, Gretzky is the greatest Canadian who ever lived. He was a hockey genius. And he goes, are we going to watch Norway and Canada tonight, Papa? I said, yes, we're going to watch together. He says, I can't wait to watch Gretzky play. But the Gretzky metaphor is important, and I'll bring up my son in a second. And I use this all by way of segue because I want you to put yourselves in the psyche of a Wayne Gretzky and as many analogs, predecessors and successors. Mario Lemieux, Guy Lafleur, Steve Eisem, Dale Hawerchuk, etc., all the way to Sidney Crosby today. Imagine the psyche of that type of Canadian. I'm not sure that the mentality of the hockey player, killers on ice, repeats itself in many other aspects of Canadian life, with the few exceptions. That is to say, when the Canadian hockey player shows up mentally, the opponent is often finished before the game is started, and starting with the United States as an opponent. Only the Russians perhaps have a parity of mental toughness in this regard and don't subordinate readily. This is not unimportant because it shows that we are a primary nation in hockey and we behave like a primary nation. We play to win. In the field of strategy, which I'll speak about, which is the field of big imperatives, big interests, big objectives, super stakes for a country, a state, I'm going to explain to you why I don't believe that Canada indeed has ever played at that level, certainly does not play at that level today, but will one day have to play at that level. We will have to become Wayne Gretzky's, and there will have to be many of them in this field if we're not only going to achieve our objectives, but indeed be a proper state, a sovereign state in what should probably be a more difficult strategic century. Let me start with the Constitution before I get to strategy. I get my child, Noah, who's extremely bright, to read the Constitution every night. I would highly commend it to you. How many of you have read the Constitution over the last few weeks? How many of you carry it? You have? In preparation? How many of you carry it in your side pocket like I do? The Constitution, of course, is not one document. It is a corpus of documents, principles, rules, even supra-statutes that date not just to 1867, the modern foundation of Canada, but preceded arguably in many ways, especially when you talk about the common law principles of the Constitution. But of course, the most famous part of the Constitution. Before the Charter came, a lot of my students think the Charter is the Constitution. The Charter is a small part of the Constitution. The most famous act is the old British North America Act 1867, which is today called the Constitution Act 1867. Now, let me preface before I dive into the Constitution Act, which I love, by saying that when I asked an RA of mine, a research assistant, to calculate how long states have tended to last over the last 2 centuries, all states, the answer was about 6 decades. 6 decades, which is why the discussion that Meta and I had about Ukraine, which I know extremely well, having worked there at pretty serious levels for quite a while in the language, is instructive. Because as I used to say to my Ukrainian friends, and certainly here to incredulous reception, it's not obvious that Ukraine should exist tomorrow as a state. Just because Kiev is one of the most beautiful cities in the world to my mind, and life is beautiful in Kiev, does not suggest that it's a reality that will endure. Indeed, before the last 20 years, Ukraine only had 1 or 2, maximum 2 years of proper independence. So the 20 years to date have been exceptional rather than the rule. In Canada's case, if I say that the average length of existence of states over the last 2 centuries has been 60 years, Canada has existed how long? Almost 150. This is highly exceptional. It's even exceptional in Canadian history because before 1867, the modern foundation of Canada, we had quasi-revolution in the 1830s, 1840s, leading to the Union Act, of course the Durham Report, which we would have all studied in school, and of course before that, revolution would have come around 1763, the Royal Proclamation, with quasi-revolutions all the way. So in its current form, Canada has been stable for about 150 years. This is highly exceptional. And we'll get back to that exceptional fact shortly. How many years did the Soviet Union endure? 70 years. At the time, people living in the Soviet Union thought it was interminable. It could not break. Stalin would be there forever, and the Stalinist regime would end. It broke quite rapidly. That Soviet Union today is discussed in terms of the Soviet experiment in a famous course at Queen's University in Kingston. Israel has lasted, to this date, less than 70 years. Singapore, almost 50 years. I'm not sure Singapore, which is a remarkable state, will last the century. And that shouldn't surprise us, even though it would shock Singaporeans. It's not obvious that Singapore will be on the map in any meaningful way at the end of this century. We can walk through that in Q&A. All this to paint context, to say, in strategic terms, 60 years means that constitutions change. They change because of wars, because of revolutions, cataclysms, insurrections, accidents, negligence, secession, and so on. Constitution changes in reaction to strategic events, big events. So if you imagine the state as a bit of a two-sided coin, okay? The one side is the constitutional face, which is almost like our own constitution, the corpus of the state. It is the system of order and justice. It's not just a document. It is the actual constitution of the state. And the flip side of that coin is strategy. Big events in the world, big forces, big vectors, competing interests that press against the constitutional framework and against which it presses. Does everyone feel that metaphor? Because that constitutional corpus needs to be efficient in the strategic world if that state is to achieve its basic objectives. If it's deficient and if the strategic stakes are huge, the Constitution collapses. A new order takes its place. Perhaps domestically, perhaps through annexation, anything can happen. Okay? So constitutions change in relation to strategic events, and constitutions also inform strategic events and are used for strategy, which again, to repeat, is the big stuff the big interests, the big vectors and imperatives, the big projects of societies and states, usually in the world, but also to secure the state. Now, given that context, we understand now the 1867 Constitution of Canada as not having been written on a piece of paper by white men of limited travel, limited education, but considerable chutzpah in a vacuum. It was written in a strategic context, and it was twofold in its most important sense. That is, the Americans were breathing down the necks of British North America for annexation. They had just consolidated after the American Civil War, and Britain wanted to decamp. So Macdonald, through hook and crook, through great cunning, charisma, somehow soldered together what, to my mind, is an empire-sized country, even at 4 provincial units: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Empire-sized, but with only 3 million people at the time. This was a mirage intended to create some sort of constitutional framework that would be efficacious strategically vis-a-vis the Americans, with the hope, however, that the British would protect us. Which is why when I read the Constitution, and the first time I read it, and I suggest to you, this is a serious point, Google just the preamble of the Constitution Act 1867 tonight, and find the following words in the preamble. The Constitution will, quote, conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. That's still in our Constitution today. To me, those were revelatory words, shocking almost. But they told us everything about the Canadian project at birth, and towards the end I will argue that it's still with us. We haven't removed ourselves or extricated ourselves, psychologically at least, from that cage, the initial impulse created by the Macdonald-Cartier Constitution, 1867. Conduce to the welfare of the provinces, first proposition in that phrase. What does that mean? That means federalism. Canada will be a federal state. Indeed, we will be world-class federalists. We will feel it in our bones. Federalism is of us, obviously. The Constitution Act is all about federalism. Promote the interests of the British Empire. That's strategy. The interests are not ours. They are those of the British Empire. So in some ways, when I read that, I say, we've actually outsourced the strategic imagination to the big boys at Westminster. We will promote those interests, but they will create the framework. They will create the strategic terms. We will play tactically within that box. And that is our vocation. Okay? Indeed, at Confederation, Macdonald and the Followers Confederation proudly fancied themselves English gentlemen, British gentlemen, and Canada as a colonial annex to the British Empire. That was a glorified status. Today, maybe we look at it with chagrin. We take umbrage at it. What do you mean we're colonial? That was the status. We were proud, but we were secondary as a nation. The primary nation was at Westminster, and we were promoting that project, proudly so. If you read the British Constitution Act, British North American Constitution Act 1867, there are only two phrases that speak to any international mission for Canada. I've mentioned the first. The Federation would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. First phrase. There's only one other phrase in the entire Constitution Act which speaks to any global mission for Canada. And that's section 132, which speaks to imperial treaties. Canada cannot sign or negotiate imperial treaties, but it can implement them. That's all it says. Silence. No foreign affairs power. A little bit of a discussion on the military and the militia, yes, mostly for domestic purposes. But very little in the preamble and otherwise about Canada playing a role as a sovereign state in the world. Now, to me, that was shocking as a person who's interested in international affairs. And I publish Global Brief. I write about international affairs. I dream about Canada and the world. Sometimes unpopularly so. And I will walk through some of that dreaming towards the end of my talk. And I will persuade you that it is not for naught to dream about Canada and the world. We are one of the big players of this century. I will persuade you in that respect. But let me just start by saying that the Constitution Act suggests a paradox, because certainly at some point Canada did begin to play a proper role in international affairs, a sovereign role. The British left. The Statute of Westminster was passed. The Governor-General started appointing diplomats. The Prime Minister would declare war and broker the peace, certainly from the Second World War onward. And we would have all the trappings of a proper state. Not just G7, G8, but a military, diplomacy, that type of capacity. But the Constitution said nothing about that. And there were no words on which to hang for jurists, constitutionalists, and judges so that they can interpret and elaborate a tradition of Canadian strategic thinking in constitutional terms. So the paradox in the book I publish is the following. The Constitution is silent on strategy. It's a tactical constitution. And yet Canada obviously plays in the strategic world. We have big objectives to uphold. National security. Let it be the Arctic. We have enemies. We have peaces to broker. We've got R2P here. We've got trade negotiations. Pick your battle, any battle. Pick your conflict. Canada is of it in many cases. We're pivoting to Asia. Yesterday we were pivoting to the Americas. These are big strategic goals, and the Constitution and its interpreters don't know what to say about it. So the people who work on international affairs don't understand the constitutional tradition that supports them, and the people who work on the Constitution work outside of the strategic mission of the Canadian state. They work within two traditions, and they work very well in Canada. The first tradition is federalism. The second tradition is civil rights. From the 80s onwards, the Charter started to dominate constitutional thinking and scholarship, and obviously decisions in the courts. These are schools that are very developed, sophisticated, world-class in Canada. But there's no school of saying, well, what does the Constitution say about what Canada can and cannot do in the world? Because obviously we're working in the world not outside of the constitutional framework. The constitutional framework, on the contrary, channels what we can and cannot do. It's just we haven't put the two together. So I jokingly say that more than the French and the English, the constitutionalists and the international thinkers or analysts or foreign affairs thinkers are the two great solitudes in Canada. And so the third school I try to offer in this book, The Strategic Constitution, is a reconciliation of the two. Say, we've got a tactical constitution. It's interpreted tactically. Indeed, a lot of our international affairs thinking is, as a result, tactical. But can we mine that constitution and try to understand what the strategic potential is of Canada, even though it wasn't intended to be a major strategic player? And indeed you can. So I try to come up with a framework, and I won't go too far into the bowels of the framework. The framework is, can I audit the Constitution, all of the big decisions, the big areas, the big Constitution acts, the big principles, to understand what the real potential is of Canada, constitutionally speaking, in the world, if there is a political will. Now, I'm not here to talk about one government or another. Governments make their choices, okay? And we'll never reach a consensus in Canada about everything, indeed about most things. But if governments want to make choices, what is their maximal potential in strategic terms in a number of scenarios? So we can give the most basic example. I mean, I mine the Constitution for everything from the military to the diplomacy to natural resources to the economic power of Canada, the people power. the national population, not just the nature of the population, what I call the talent or quality of the population, the quantum of the population. How many people? That certainly matters to what we can achieve in the world. Later on, I'll try to persuade you that one day Canada may, indeed should have 100 million people by the end of the century, right? For strategic purposes, okay? Communications, transportation, even food. Someone needs to feed the military. If you have no food for the military, you can't achieve basic goals, right? I know that sounds absurd in today's Canada, but in acute strategic situations, obvious. Okay? Energy. Do we have energy self-sufficiency in acute situations? Do we have the capacity to ensure sufficiency? So you mine the Constitution and you come up with the conclusion that actually Canada is very potent in its strategic potential through the Constitution. Even though the Constitution paradoxically was intended for Canada to be largely domestic in focus, largely tactical, Canada can achieve great things through its constitutional framework because it's very flexible. Now, I don't know whether Macdonald was a closet strategic genius or extremely cunning, or whether we've arrived at this, the likely scenario, by happenstance, by serendipity. But we can do great things with the Constitution. It's eminently flexible if it's used. And all of this stuff is constitutional. Let me give you some examples, and let me give you some counterexamples. The Prime Minister, contrary to some debates here and there, and this is an analytical point, I'm not going to glorify it, the Prime Minister can wake up one day and declare war on any country in the world. If he wakes up on the left side of the bed, it could be Libya. If he wakes up on the right side of the bed, it could be Poland. I hope he doesn't mix them up. He can at the same time broker a peace with any country in the world. He can broker the terms. He can set up a peace table anywhere in the world. Internationally provide there's an invitation, but anywhere in Canada, and broker a peace, win a Nobel Prize. He can use the military for almost any purposes. He can send diplomats anywhere in the world and fund them through Parliament, through the spending power, extremely flexibly. Appointment powers are almost without limits in the strategic realm, from Chief of Defense Staff to the Clerk of the Privy Council to the big diplomats to obviously the ministry. The Prime Minister has huge powers, which are actually in many cases greater than those of the American president. Okay? That's an example of the great capacious flexibility that we have in the most brutal constitutional terms through our Constitution, through something called the royal prerogative, which is a common law principle which says the king has discretion. And that stayed with us to this day. So neither Parliament nor statute nor Supreme Court decisions have really clipped that in many meaningful ways, with a few exceptions to which I'll get. What about pivoting? The Prime Minister can wake up and pivot to Asia, which we did last year. I don't know whether you're aware, we're pivoting to Asia. In 2007, we declared that we're pivoting to the Americas. We're going to be a leader in the Americas. The Prime Minister can do that quite flexibly and move the apparatus. Okay? Contradiction. In 2007, in my view, rightly, the Canadian Prime Minister, Harper, in a speech in the Americas, in Latin America, declared that Canada would be a leader in the Americas. We're going to be a strategic player. And he outlined principles of democracy, security, governance. Question, from a strategic perspective, where are all the Spanish speakers? Where are all the Portuguese speakers in Canada that are going to populate that strategy? Surely, if you're going to be a player in the Americas, let's all agree, you need a good mass of people who can speak Spanish and Portuguese. You can't have everybody that's either Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking, or French-speaking show up and hope to be received properly. more recently, we started pivoting to Asia. Asia's the rage, so we pivot to Asia. Prime Minister said we're going to pivot. Where are all the Asian language speakers? Bahasa Indonesia, Mandarin, Korean, Hindi, Japanese. Now you might say, of course, they're on the streets of Toronto. We've got plenty of them. But I'm speaking in a strategic sense. In a strategic sense, the speakers are created where? They're created or not created in the schools of the nation. Schools of the nation fall under the education competence in Section 93 of the Constitution, and that is a provincial competence. So, the Prime Minister has, through the royal prerogative, infinite flexibility to pivot whichever way he pleases, but constitutionally we're at a bit of a stumbling block, because in order for it to be a credible pivot, you need to bring a lot of the provincial competences along. You need to move the curriculum. So Ontario and Quebec and British Columbia in many ways can undermine, torpedo, compromise effective foreign policy, whether they realize it or not, simply by not producing people who have the talent that is required for Canada to be effective in a given realm. Which means that if Canada's going to pivot to, in the Americas, Canada's going to pivot to Asia, Canada's got to speak to the provinces actively. So there you see a contradiction between the great capacity of Canada to do war and peace at the national level, but now you get into the bottlenecks federally. I'll give you one more, and then I'll go through a few paradoxes, and then I'll try to provoke you a little bit before we get to Q&A with some closing theses. Treaties. We mentioned Section 132 of the Constitution Act. What was the biggest treaty that was recently announced, at least for signature, by the Prime Minister? The EU trade agreement, for which the text has yet to be seen, but it's a big deal. It took Canada how many years? About 4, 5, maybe even 6 years to negotiate it. That's slow for an important agreement. Why? Well, few people know that in 1937, there was a famous Supreme Court decision. Actually, it was at the Privy Council in Britain, in London. We didn't have the High Court at the time. They took the superior decisions. It was a decision called Labour Conventions. Labour Convention said, we've got Section 132 of the Constitution Act, treaties. The federal government can sign, it can negotiate, but the provinces are the ones who will implement those parts of the treaty that are provincial in nature, in the competence. Education, for example. Prime Minister can't go out and sign an education treaty and then hope to make it law. Problem with Kyoto, same with Kyoto. There were aspects of that treaty that were provincial. So when Chrétien signed, he probably did so knowing that there would be problems down the value chain. Similarly, the Prime Minister of Canada knows that if he's going to negotiate with the EU, he's got to bring the provinces along. Because if he doesn't bring them along, the opposite number probably won't sign, knowing that it can't become law in Canada. This is a bottleneck. It means we're slow. I know it's glorious to say Prince Edward Island should have a veto over the national capacity to quickly negotiate treaties, but it's not very elegant. It's not very efficacious, strategically speaking. We could be faster, but we've got this decision, and we've got to live with it. Few people know it, but it's constitutional law. So that's a paradox, again, that impedes the ability of Canada to negotiate quickly. This leads to a funny scenario. Imagine Canada losing a war. Canada has never lost a war. I would never wish it upon us. We're almost indomitable, right? But if Canada were to lose a war, as you know, the victor would try to impose terms on us, terms of surrender. So you can imagine a paradoxical scenario where the Prime Minister of Canada shows up, surrenders, the terms are dictated, but the Prime Minister goes back to the provinces, and the provinces refuse to implement parts of the Treaty of Surrender that don't fall under their competence. The Prime Minister goes back to the victor and says, sorry, Prince Edward Island has said they will not implement the terms of surrender. at which point the victor, it's almost like the Trotsky scenario at Brest-Litovsk, neither war nor peace. The prime minister will say, sorry, we can't. The victor will press again. The prime minister says, I surrender again. And then the victor imposes even more draconian terms. And he goes back and says, please, Prince Edward Island, will you please yield? But then, and the treaty framework won't allow. So this is the paradox of strategic defeat. Let me just go through a few key cases of blockages in the Canadian constitutional framework for us trying to achieve big things as a country through our constitution, if we wanted to. I mentioned the education and the pivot example. It's a big one. There's the Cotter case. I don't know if you heard of the Omar Cotter series of cases. I won't go into the details, but that's a big one. In Canada, of course, it's mostly viewed through Section 7, a few other sections, and of course Section 1 of the Charter, and through a rights lens, and properly so. But through a strategic lens, one of the dangerous precedents of the Cotter decisions was that not just the intelligence services, but you might even extrapolate to other services in Canada, the military, diplomacy, ministers, civil servants, agents of the state going abroad, cannot engage in activities that are contrary to international law. Not just because they don't want to or it's not kosher, but it's against the Constitution. So you're breaking the supreme law of the land. That might seem elegant if you're looking at the Constitution only through a rights lens, but in a strategic lens it means we're going to become very risk averse in situations where it's not clear what the law is and we have big interests at stake. And this is not an area that's been clarified by the courts. There's another case called the Smith case. It's an administrative law case. It's at the Federal Court of Appeal level, I believe, not quite a Supreme Court precedent, but it was a Canadian man who was on death row and may still be on death row in Montana. And the government of the day, the Harper government, decided that they would no longer provide legal support for this person on death row, which is a change in policy. And the courts intervened to say that, no, you had to provide legal support because you've changed the policy without proper procedure, without defying legitimate expectations, as it were. Now, in purely administrative law terms, or on that logic, it might seem kosher. But again, if you were to read the Constitution strategically, this suggests that it might limit over time the capacity of a government to come to power and drastically change its posture strategically on big questions, because the court's going to come in and say, well, you closed this base in country A and you didn't give proper notice, and as a result many Canadians lost their job or contracts were broken. So on the contract law, on the administrative law side, perhaps it's kosher, but strategically it starts to limit the erstwhile flexibility which we spoke about. What about the Aboriginal case? If I spoke about a little bit about Quebec, a lot about federalism, let me put to you, and this is a good segue to our theses. The Aboriginal question, in strategic terms, not just in justice terms, will be one of the great complicating factors for Canada this century. And that's through the constitutional vector, because there's a whole series of cases which have now encaged the Canadian state into certain behavior through justice terms, things like Delgamu, all the way to Sparrow, and more recently watch for a case called William, that conditions Canada to behave in a certain way to make up for lost time and injustices. Properly so. But at some point, the Canadian state might become shackled and it will not be able to properly exploit resources to even achieve basic objectives, economic, strategic. Okay? So there's a trade-off there, but we'll have to be very sophisticated about the constitutional law and the way we negotiate it, because it's not just the justice lens that's at play. Remember, justice is an internal arrangement. Strategy is a global arrangement. One more before I get into the theses. Spending power. People heard about the spending power of governments. Governments tax, they can spend. In Canada, the federal government can almost tax on anything it wants, on anybody it wishes, and spend on anything it wants. It can spend even on education, provided it doesn't pass laws. Same with the provincial government. So today you would hear Flaherty say, if you think we've cut spending to Ontario, get your spending in order, raise your own taxes, right? So this is an arbitrage of spending power and taxation power. And the rule is that, constitutionally speaking, the federal government can spend on whatever it wants, even with conditions. Provinces the same. But this also means that the provinces can spend on international affairs, didn't you know? So although it's not surprising that in the media no one says anything, it always surprises me when you see the Ontario government all of a sudden dishing out money to emergency aid in the Philippines. There's a disaster. Small quantum, but still. You would think, as a lay observer would say, isn't that federal competence? Shouldn't the federal government be giving money or not be giving money? But the provinces can spend wherever they want. This gives the potential paradox of, let's say, Canada saying, we're going to privilege country A in the Americas. We're going to focus on the Americas and the following countries. And the provinces saying, well, we might focus on Africa. Worse still, you can imagine a scenario where Canada picks an ally. Let's say in the current event, Canada says, we're for Ukraine. We give money to Ukraine. And Ukraine has some tensions, some amity, some tensions with Russia. Provinces say, there's disaster relief in Russia. We give money to Russia. And the provinces are now contradicting, through spending power, the behavior of the federal government. Who dictates the national interest? Constitutionally speaking, there's no barrier. So that's the strategic constitution in a nutshell. I try to go through the gives and takes, what I call constitutional statics in a host of scenarios. Everything from Arctic sovereignty to full war to counter-terrorism to Canada and the Americas. And again, it doesn't matter what your end is. If you're a peacenik, you're a military person, you like the environment, you like aid, I'm talking about the machinery that supports whatever end you fancy. We're talking about the means. Let me put a few points to you and then we'll close and go for questions. I mentioned that states have attended the last 60 years and that Canada is exceptional. At some point, we may end up with a Quebec referendum. Yeah, indeed, some put it nearer to us than further. And shouldn't surprise us, could be cyclical. It's part of our constitutional strategic reality. I'm going to put to you that in my analysis of the Constitution and strategy, Canada would not survive a Quebec secession. Because territorially speaking, we would lose the biggest component, we would lose territorial continuity, and no one would be able to stitch this all back together. Because no one from Newfoundland, Nunavut, and Victoria would subordinate to a government in Ottawa after Quebec goes, or if Quebec goes. That's the first scenario. To me, there's some constitutional logic to that. Second thesis, the Aboriginal question. Watch it. Watch it not just through justice lens, which is fascinating. Constitutional law of an Aboriginal law is the most fascinating thing happening in the field right now. Watch it through a strategic lens. At some point, you could have scenarios where Canada wishes to achieve a basic objective, but is not able to do so because the Aboriginal vector, legitimated through constitutional jurisprudence, becomes very difficult. So you can see confrontations there, and indeed handicaps. Third, I mentioned to you that states last 60 years, Canada's last 150 years. When was the last war in North America? Anyone know? It was after 1812. When was the last time that there was friction territorially for Canada? Turbot War, 1995. I'm joking. It's not a real war. We won that. We beat the Spaniards quite clinically there. But in reality, The last real tensions we had were in the 1860s, 1870s around Confederation with the Americans, the Fenian raids, okay? And that concluded in the Treaty of Washington, 1871, at which point the Americans were our natural enemy. Now they're our best friend. We haven't had war for 150 years in Canada, and indeed in North America, English North America, English and French. Mexican Revolution, a little bit in the southern United States. That warless reality, for Canada in particular, is exceptional. It's exceptional in Canadian history, because in every century since the European landing, there has been very terrible bloodshed in North America. That's longitudinally, except for the last century. And across the continents in the last century, there was only one continent that was spared any description of territorial warfare. One continent. That's North America. Even Australia was bombarded by the Japanese on its northern flank. Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, all suffered warfare. Well, in my analysis, this is more the rule than the exception. At some point this century, there will be some description of strategic conflict in North America again. I can give you good reasons. Perhaps we'll go over that in the Q&A. This means that the tactical, constitutional, and strategic, tactical constitutional culture that we have, and the naive strategy that we tend to do as a result of that tactical heritage will have to change. Because at some point, our luck will run out. We'll have to play at a higher strategic level. And as I said, if there was little strategic culture in the Constitution over the last 150 years, there were few events to be able to really give us the imagination to create that culture. But this century, it may change. And so we'll have to play at a higher level if we're going to survive well beyond the 150 years, beyond 200 years, as a state that can secure its interests and achieve big things. So let me put it to you that way. One of the things I like to say in closing, in the spirit of that ability for Canada to achieve bigger things, is that we ought to imagine ourselves as an outsider often imagines ourselves, as a country one day of 100 million people. This is not just policy, it's a metaphor. It's to say, I try to ban amongst my students the notion of Canada being a small country. Sometimes the mind is small, the country is huge. If you look at some of the basic framework that I've put in the book for how you mine strategic potential, after Russia, who's got the biggest territory in the world? Canada. Stable borders, natural resources that are the envy of the world. We're first in many measures of natural resources. Highly educated population, stable government, deep history. The only thing we lack at that level in what are called factors of power is a sufficiently large population that has economic manifestations, but also in terms of the basic instruments, the military, diplomacy, the sharp stuff makes us much smaller than we could be and perhaps ought to be in order to perform at that higher level. So the metaphor of 100 million is that I actually think we'll get there one way or another, whether we wish to or not, is that we ought to think of ourselves as this more strategic, more capacious, more potent player, because the world will demand that of us this century. There will be forces that will force our hand. Can we play at that level? And that is, in many cases, more a psychological question than a material one. Thank you very much.